Olean and salutations once again to the Truth Core, whoever and wherever you may be on the planet. This is JLL, recording on the 28th, 29th of October, 2021. Purpose of this talk is to inaugurate a series of talks in a new vein, on a new basis, and with a new direction. And I'm gathering and collecting this projected series under the title of the Gentian Initiative. Now, I won't say right now, I won't define what the Gentian Initiative is. My intention is to show you what it is by what I say and propose in the forthcoming talks in that category, which ought to be, of course, a playlist. Yesterday, an event happened on my channel, John Lamb Lash, which didn't surprise me, and in fact, I anticipated. You could say that I intentionally brought it upon myself. I wanted to see what would happen if I did something. I wanted to see if it would produce certain consequences, and sure enough it did. And that amounts to absolutely nothing at all. And it has no effect whatsoever on what I intend to say, nor does it impede me in any way from continuing to talk to you about anything I choose. Of course, everyone who uses the internet and so-called social media for communication knows that the controllers of that media can shut you down. But what does that imply? It only implies that they can, using the means at their disposal, prevent you from sharing what you want to say, but they can't prevent you from saying it. Be assured that I am not at all concerned about the measures taken to prevent me from sharing what I say. I don't play that game. And I won't play that game. Consequently, I'm starting here with a new approach. And to begin that approach, I want to advise you of something. Let's say I want to set a protocol that I invite you to follow. Be assured as well that I intend to follow my own protocol. Hey, that's the least I can do. Except, possibly, on one occasion. It's possible that I will make one exception to the protocol I'm going to describe to you now. We'll see about that. In any case, it goes like this, my friends. Among the many and various religious and spiritual traditions in the world, such as Vedic philosophy, Buddhism, Christianity, Mormonism, Baha'i, Theosophy, Catholicism, Protestant theology, you name it. Among these programs, belief systems, systems of faith, whatever you want to call them, there are three which are known as the great world religions. They are the Abrahamic religions, and they all have the same root. And among those three, there is one whose adherents hold a particular rule, which is that for them, the name of their supreme deity cannot be pronounced openly and publicly. There is a taboo, an interdiction, upon pronouncing that name. As far as I know, that rule, that religious taboo is exceptional and particular to a certain group, a certain belief system. I don't know of any other religious program that forbids its adherents and devotees to say the name of the supreme deity of their belief system. But anyway, there it is. It stands for itself. It stands on its own. And I'm not criticizing it in any way whatsoever. But the protocol I now propose to you is simple. You can adopt policy in which you carefully observe that you do not pronounce a certain name, a certain word. You don't have to say it, ever. Not because it's forbidden. In the first place, you need to know what the word is that you're not going to say. And therefore, you have the freedom to choose not to say that name. That's the protocol. Now, I'm sure you might ask, upon hearing this odd proposal, is the name which you know well, and you are free not to pronounce openly, the name of a supreme deity? Well, in a way it is. It's the name of a supreme act of self-deification. And I'll leave it at that. So what about this topic, this trope, this title, the Gentian initiative? Well, in the first place, it refers to a flower, the blue gentian, which you see depicted in the thumbnail. So that flower, simple, beautiful flower, with the perfect white at the center, is the symbol or emblem of this initiative. There are various aspects to this initiative, but the central one, which you need to know in this introduction, is that it concerns a great question, a generic question, a universal question, something that could be of interest to all well-meaning people. The question is, why do good people allow evil to prevail? You can consider that question like a key. It's a key that you put in a lock, and you turn the key, and it opens the door to some place where we, all of us, you and I, have never yet gone. And that's where it's my privilege to take you now in this series of talks. So where do I begin? The Gentian initiative needs to be developed in layers. And so here is the first layer. Look at yourself, look at other people in the world, not only those in your immediate family and community and nation, but the people of all nations on the earth. And when you consider them and look at them, how does the way you see yourself influence the way that you see them? For instance, if you are an inhabitant of the country of Greece, and you look at yourself and you see that you are Greek. That's your culture, your ancestry, and your nationality. Then when you look across the waters to Libya, to the southern Mediterranean, or when you look north to Germany or Sweden, how do you see the people of those nationalities relative to the way you see yourself? Well, obviously, they are different in many respects because they participate in different cultures and environments. They have different histories from you. And so there are obvious differences. A Greek individual looking at a Dane sees obvious differences in behavior, differences in the food they eat, in the way they dress, in the books they read, in the references they have throughout their culture and their history. They're different. But when you or I or anyone of any nationality looks at others, are there not as well similarities that you see? Is there some kind of generic or innate indwelling similarity that you see in other people, as well as the differences that you see in them, which are obvious and undeniable? Differences in appearance as well, in the shape of their bodies, the color of their hair and their eyes, the color of their skin, and so forth. In your perception of others, which is based on the way you perceive yourself, don't ever forget that, do you as well see generic or universal similarities? And if so, what are they? Now, if you intend to follow this series of talks, there are a few guidelines that you need to observe really closely. And they're simple and obvious. Actually, they're just propositions of common sense. There's nothing mysterious or complicated about them. For instance, how about I say this? When you, as an individual belonging to a certain nationality, of a certain place and race by origin, look at others, the differences are obvious. Once again, the difference between a Greek and a Dane. Well, the music that Greeks listen to is not the same as the music that Danes listen to, is it? Or the food they eat, clothes they wear, and, of course, the language they speak. The differences are obvious, but are the similarities equally obvious? This is the question to ask. This is a nuance to bear closely in your mind. I propose to you that while the differences are obvious and can be immediately described and located as you scan the spectrum of peoples of all nations in the world, on the other hand, the similarities are not obvious, not in that way. The point to bear in mind, the leading point here, which is a takeaway from this introductory talk, is that the similarities or generic attributes of all people are not obvious like their differences are. The generic similarities are assumed or attributed. Give you a concrete example. Let's say that someone who is of English nationality, living in the British Isles, feels a fondness for animals, for dogs, even for certain types of dogs, say terriers or pit bulls. And in the way that individual self-identifies, they know, without thinking about it, that they are fond of those dogs, of that breed, and they act accordingly. They show special kindness and attention to that animal. But if that British person turns around and attributes that same respect and fondness for a breed of dog to people of other nationalities, that is an attribution. You may realize that I'm arguing here, presenting my case, by following the method of Socrates, which is called inductive reasoning. That is to say, you reason from an individual to a general case. Take another trivial example. I happen to really love hollyhocks. I could say that hollyhocks are one of my favorite flowers. But if I look at someone else from another nation, say someone from Syria or Japan or Finland or Canada, and I assume that they have the same love of hollyhocks that I have, well, that obviously is a rather dodgy proposition, isn't it? What am I doing? I'm attributing to the other something that I know and feel to be innate to myself. I think from these two examples, you could see that that is indeed a tricky proposition, and it might be advisable to look very carefully about what you attribute to others based on your self-attribution. So, to introduce the Gentian initiative, I offer you this tool, the concept of self-attribution. And I will refer to it continuously in this series of talks. In order to do my best in presenting and developing this tool, the concept of self-attribution, here's another example in the frame of inductive reasoning. Say that there is someone who belongs to people of Moldavia, and say it's a woman, and say that she happens to really enjoy the musical compositions of, well, fill in the blank. How about Shostakovich? So this Moldavian woman really enjoys and loves the music of Shostakovich. That is part of her self-attribution. She attributes to herself that love and appreciation. Now what happens, say, if she meets someone from Japan, or someone from New Zealand, or Argentina, a woman of her own age, a woman of her maturity and intelligence, let's say? Does she attribute to that other woman a love of the works of Shostakovich? Well, probably not, because that would be a rather rash attribution, wouldn't it? However, there is a qualification. Although the Moldavian woman might not assume that, say, her Argentinian acquaintance appreciates Shostakovich in the way that she does, and may not even assume that she knows anything about Shostakovich, the Moldavian woman might assume that our Argentinian acquaintance is capable of appreciating Shostakovich in the way that she does. And so it's natural in the course of humans getting to know each other across cultures, across nations and races, it's natural that she might bring up the subject and talk about it enthusiastically and passionately, attributing to her Argentinian counterpart either the capacity or the desire, or both, to know and appreciate the works of Shostakovich. And well, can you see that she could be entirely mistaken in that assumption? The Argentinian woman may neither be interested in nor capable of that appreciation, which is inherent and innate to the Moldavian woman. Now, to conclude this introduction, I'd like to add one more qualification that you need to consider and apply when you're thinking about self-attribution, your self-attributions. I invite you to consider that there are two categories of self-attributions: particular and generic. So my particular self-attributions, for instance, comprise a whole range of things: my tastes, my attitudes, the way I dress, the literature I enjoy, the music I enjoy, and many other attributes that are particular to me as an individual. But in addition to those attributes, which I assign to myself, therefore self-attributions, there are other attributes of a generic and universal category which are different. For instance, my particular love of certain Russian poets is highly particular. You can call it eccentric or idiosyncratic. Everyone has their idiosyncratic preferences that belong to the range of their self-attribution, right? But on the other hand, what about honesty? What about the code of fairness? So suppose that in addition to my specific and peculiar and idiosyncratic attributes and tastes and attitudes, I attribute to myself a generic quality, a generic moral attribute. For instance, fairness. So innately, when I look into myself, I know myself to be someone who intends to treat others fairly. In other words, I don't have the innate intention in my nature, in my moral nature, to trick or cheat other people. So I attribute that moral attribute to myself. I assign that moral attribute to myself. Can you see how that moral attribute belongs to a different category than specific or particular tastes or attributes or capacities that I might have? For instance, I have the capacity to read poetry and to interpret poetry and to teach the particular features of poetic composition. I don't expect everyone else around me to have that talent, but that is a particular talent specific to me. It can't be compared to a generic moral attribute, such as the code of fairness. I want you to reflect closely on that difference. Again, I'm using the Socratic method. There are individual attributes that you have that are specific and personal. You happen to like rap music, or you happen to like Gothic architecture. You see, it doesn't really make any difference. There are thousands of factors in that category of personal and idiosyncratic attributes. On the other hand, there is a limited and selective number of generic moral attributes, such as the sense of fairness, or honesty, or compassion. We'll get to the list soon enough. So finally, in conclusion, just watch me closely as I argue from the individual to the generic case. Wouldn't it be unreasonable or even absurd for me to attribute to others the acute and passionate interest that I have in the poetics of the Romantic movement of the 19th century, Wouldn't that be a bit of a stretch? Well, if that's obviously not appropriate, if that obviously won't play out in reality, tested against the circumstances of life and the differences between people, then how can I assume that what I attribute to myself as generic moral qualities, such as the sense of fairness, would likewise be found in others as well? Would that also not be a reckless and implausible attribution coming from myself directed toward others? Would it not obviously be an implausible presumption upon others to attribute to them anything like that? Enough said, and I'll continue to develop the Gentian initiative along these lines. And in the meantime, of course, I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.